All right, folks. Thanks for being here. How cool is this space with all this stuff in here? This is kind of like what the inside of my head looks like, I think. It's lots of flickering and rotation. Yeah, no, thanks for spending your evening here. Hand over to Cassidy to say hello.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you all for coming. My name is Cassidy Westron. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here. And tonight we have this graduate student talk with Nikhil Singh. So we're very excited about that. The Graduate Student Talk is a series where we invite graduate students to expand on our exhibitions using their expertise in a similar subject matter as a way to see how art and research are overlapping on MIT's campus. Tonight we'll be hearing from Nikhil Singh, a PhD candidate at the MIT Media Lab's Opera of the Future group. His work focuses on human-AI interaction and multimodal machine learning across application areas including creative, immersive, and informational media with a special interest in sound. As an artist and musician, he has co-created musical and multimedia works presented at venues like Moogfest, Mass MoCA, and the International Space Station. In this talk, Singh will discuss the many relationships that exist in nature and can be made to exist in art between sound and image through the lens of Steina's video works presented in the space. At the end, we'll have an opportunity to have a Q&A, and you'll have a chance to ask any questions you may have. And thank you so much again for being here and having interest in our programming. And I'll hand it over to Nikhil here. Thank you.
Great. All right, thanks, Cassidy. Yeah, I'm excited to be here, excited you're all here. And if you'll indulge me just in a moment of reflection. I was thinking about my own relationship to Steina's work, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about her work because it's here, and I'd love for you to really experience it. But as a jumping off point, Steina started as a musician and came to sort of audiovisual work through music. And I also started as a musician and came to audiovisual work through music. And I think this is more than just a coincidence. I think there are some good reasons that this happens. One of them is that music has a lot of really compelling conceptual features that generalize well to other media. Things like timing, layering, things like composition, rhythm, proportion. All of these things you think about a lot when you're working on music, and they translate very well to other media. And I think that these kinds of ideas pushed me to kind of explore outside music as well, and outside sound, and think about how these ideas have a life beyond that. So Steina's work is primarily as an artist, of course, and my work right now is primarily as a researcher. But at the same time, I think we share this sort of interest in empirically probing the limits of audiovisual relationships and figuring out what happens at those limits. And kind of, we both see machines and technology as kind of endogenous to that process. They really drive that relationship and what we can do with it. And so that's what I really love about this work. There are many things I love about this work, but that's one of them. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on. And I want to talk about these relationships between sound and image roughly in the three categories. The first is I want to talk about kind of representational relationships. This is like how sound and image co-occur in the real world, how visual and auditory stimuli occur and how we perceive them in the natural world, and what that kind of translates to in art. The second thing I want to talk about is where that relationship starts to get a little bit murky, a little bit metaphorical, abstracted, and where those relationships start to be engineered by humans to create these perceptual effects that we're looking for. And then the last thing I want to talk about is sort of noise and randomness, and how noise and randomness can generate cohesion between sound and image in really unexpected ways that still engage our perceptual faculties. And I'll talk a little bit about some research that asks what that might mean for machines as well. So to start with this idea of representational depictions of sounds and images, I want to ask a really simple question, which is, how do you know when a sound and an image go together, right? If I were to give you a video, how would you tell whether or not those sounds and images are concordant? Well, you do this kind of naturally on the fly. If a video is out of sync, if you're watching a live concert, you'd be able to immediately tell, but what kinds of cues are giving you that information? Well, one of the things that tells you if something's out of sync is sort of temporal coincidence, right? How things occur together in time. And if they're within, if you hear something and you see something roughly within maybe 100 milliseconds of each other, you're likely to perceive them as originating from the same source, the same kind of cause. And this sort of way of understanding cause and effect is really a key part of how we perceive the world. And these different sensory channels like sounds, images, touch, smell, etc., kind of inform how we build these coherent models of what's going on around us. So sounds and images can be bound through their temporal synchrony, but that's not the only way, right? Like they could also be bound through spatial co-location. You can localize sounds looking at images, right? So if you see a dog and then you turn away and you hear a bark coming from the same direction, you would expect that those things are part of the same source, the same dog. And in much the same way, when you watch a movie at home, you watch a film, let's say, and you have a speaker positioned next to the screen, and someone's talking in the film. That speech, you don't really perceive it as coming from the speaker. You perceive it as coming from where it visually locates. And that kind of audiovisual co-location is a really powerful way of determining what things are coming from the same place and what sounds and images go together. Another thing that you might think about is sort of semantic congruence, right? If I ask you to match images of dogs against sounds of dogs and images of cats against sounds of cats, you're unlikely to get those crossed. It's not just true of sounds that we know and images that we know and perceive in the real world, but also things that we can kind of imagine. So if you think about a baby dinosaur versus a large dinosaur, you've never heard a dinosaur, but you can still kind of imagine how those differences might translate. You can look at them and say, oh, this one should sound like a little high-pitched, quiet sound, and this should sound like a big roar, maybe. So you have these intuitions about the semantics of sound and how they relate to the visual subject matter that you might be looking at. And the last thing is you can also learn associations between sounds and images that we don't really see as part of the natural world, right? Think about thunder and lightning. Thunder and lightning we do see in the natural world, but they don't co-occur exactly the same time. They don't spatially anchor each other. How many of you have like seen a flash of lightning and then like waited for the thunder and you're like, where's the thunder, right? It takes a while. But when you watch a movie, thunder and lightning somehow happen at the same time, right? In these fictional worlds, we've translated our learned congruence between those two things and projected it into an actual temporal synchrony. But that synchrony is sort of fictitious. It doesn't exist. Another example would be, you know, if you think about the kinds of synchrony that occur between a conductor and an orchestra, right? A conductor, when you watch a conductor do this, you expect a certain equivalent kind of result from the orchestra. But really, there's no reason that me waving my hands should generate the sound of 80 people playing together. There's just this learned association that comes to expect that. And that association also is sort of different by culture. So in the US, you might expect an orchestra to play in synchrony with the conductor. In Europe, you expect the orchestra to play a little bit later. And those things can also be learned, those differences. So those are kinds of some of the ways that we learn to bind audio and images together. And this is really powerful because if you think about, you know, if you were listening to me and all these things were on, you'd be looking at me, and looking at me would help you to hear me despite the competing sounds in the environment, the sort of cocktail party problem, or speech and noise, as it's often called. And there are other ways that this is helpful too. We've started to even operationalize this in technology. We now build visually guided hearing aids, and these are starting to make it onto the market as well. So this relationship between sound and image, really powerful, really rich, and can really do a lot. But of course, this representational relationship is really capturing what's in the world, right? If you walk next door there to look at Borealis by Steina, Borealis depicts these sound-image relationships as they kind of occur in the world in this representational format. And Borealis is really depicting water primarily. And it's projected onto these enormous screens. And what you hear is water. And you're really kind of getting a sense of water through both of these modalities. And it's not really disrupting that kind of representation of what happens in nature. Despite the fact that in the actual video, water flows backwards, upwards, a lot of things are happening that disrupt the laws of physics. But somehow they don't disrupt our ability to understand the congruence between the image and the sound. And I find that really fascinating, the fact that we can perceive these as coming from one unit despite the fact that we're violating that physical plausibility. In my own work, I've really thought about how we can try to build machines that have that kind of capability. Machines don't look at water going backwards. They simply don't see that, and they certainly wouldn't hear water while the water's looking at water going backwards. All of these things don't really occur in the way that we teach machines to look at videos, for example. There are other things that don't occur like that. For example, if I were to change the words that I'm saying slightly, nothing else in the scene would change, right? You'd see the same image of me talking. Really, I might not even move very differently. My tone of voice might be the same. The background sounds might stay the same, and everything in the visual, except for my lips, might stay very much the same. But nonetheless, I would be saying something different. And machines never see that. They never see us just saying different things in exactly the same situation. But we can see that, and we're not fazed by it. We understand the consistency in the audiovisual world despite those changes. And so some of the work that I've done tries to see how we can get machines that understand these sort of counterfactuals, these changes in audiovisual relationships that occur in the world and that can occur in art, but don't necessarily disturb the underlying causes and effects that are represented. So that's one kind of direction that I'm really interested in, and I think is really powerful, is a sort of relationship between sound and images as they occur in the real world. A second kind of relationship that you could think about is what happens in animations, right? When you look at animated movies, animated films, animated videos, we really don't expect sounds to sound the way that they do in the real world. Think about bubbles. The sound designer Suzanne Chani famously said, bubbles don't make sound, but the illusion of sound design, the magic of sound design, is you can create the illusion that bubbles have sound and kind of make that feel real. And that's sort of held true in a lot of this work. A lot of work takes a kind of representational but slightly abstracted, metaphorical, playful approach to constructing these relationships between sounds and images. Bubbles are a great example of that. You can try to think about what do bubbles look like, how do they flow, how do they move, what are they made of, and try to think about similar things in the real world and how those principles and how those underlying processes can be translated into this fictional world. In Violin Power, which is over here to my left, which I really recommend watching and listening to, I think it gets at this idea of abstraction in a very different way. And this sort of takes something that's very real. It takes a video of Steina playing the violin and the audio of Steina playing the violin. These are both real materials. They're not fictitious in any real way. But by putting them together and sort of feeding them into each other, Steina creates this rich feedback loop that generates a kind of abstraction in the media. When you look at it and you listen to it, you see how these gestures take on a kind of double life. They're generating the sound and they're generating the image, but they're also generating these sort of interactions between the sound and the image. And you see, for example, how the sound can cue a switching between two camera feeds. And in doing so, creates this very unnatural, abstract relationship that nonetheless allows you to perceive that there is an action and a kind of a sound, and you can localize the actions to those sounds and see the progression of how those actions mediate those relationships. So I think it's a very interesting way to think about abstraction. And I've worked on abstraction in sound generation as well with my colleague who's here, Manuel, where we look at how concepts can kind of be represented in a more sketch-like way in sound and can be translated into things that don't sound literal. They don't sound like recordings, but they sound a little more like abstractions that evoke the general sensibility of those concepts. So I think this sort of way of abstractly constructing these representations and relationships between sounds and image is another really powerful way that sounds and images relate in the media that we consume and in the art that we create, and also in the research that we do. So the very last kind of type of relationship that I want to talk about, I call it noise or randomness. But the kind of core idea here is to go back to the thing that binds sound and image together for Steina and for me, which is not our experience in the world necessarily. It's not any of these things, even though those inform how we might go about binding them together in practice. It's signal. And Steina talks a lot about signal, and signal as kind of like this unification of sound and image. It's signal, the sort of treating sounds and images as signals that allowed Steina to do the video works in this gallery in large part. For example, Violin Power, treating them as signals and patching them sort of into each other, having these signals interact in a sort of shared signal space. In much the way that I came to this work, I came to it through signals. As I said, I started in music, and I was interested in music and signal processing, how we can treat music as signals and use those signals to understand what's happening in the music, to change what's happening in the music, and to do things with music. And the kind of magic of using signal processing is like, well, images are signals, videos are signals. These are all signals that we can try to understand, represent, and transform, and in doing so, create new relationships. So when I think about noise and randomness, I'm not just thinking about like anything could happen, but really I'm thinking about the sort of life of the signal, the electronic signal. And this work that's directly behind you, which is called Noise Fields by Steina and Woody Vasulka, is, I think, a really, really interesting and early example of how you can construct audiovisual relationships not according to the logic of our perception and our sort of like perceptual reality, but according to the logic of signals and according to the ways that signals sort of operate in their electronic environment. And so in this work, you really have these sort of chaotic, noisy signals that are patched into an audio synthesizer, visual signals patched into an audio synthesizer, and they sort of generate these really sort of flickering, chaotic, rough edges around this sort of sphere that's positioned in the middle. And I think the experience of this work is not representational, it's not metaphorical, it really doesn't allude to anything in the real world. What it is kind of tapping into some of your core instincts about how these things relate. It's tapping into that sort of temporal synchrony. It's tapping into that spatial relationship. It's tapping into all of these core instincts that we have about how sounds and images relate and transforming them using this sort of signal-based generative approach. So I find this really, really compelling and really interesting because despite the fact that, again, we're dealing with things that don't occur in the world, they don't occur in our data, machines don't see them, but we see them and we understand them, and we can find patterns in this noise. And I think that's a very powerful thing, and I think it's inspired a lot of recent and interesting work in how we teach machines to perceive the world. And work, again, with Manuel, we've done is to try to see how we can try to build towards machine understanding of such audiovisual noise. And in our work, we focus on auditory noise, where like we generate a noise, generate a slightly different noise, and try to get machines to understand the relationships between those things, seek out patterns in this noisy environment. And I think that this work hints at a lot of potential for kind of decentering the media that we consume and how that feeds into our machines, and think about alternative systems for generating perception in machines, and how that might really build towards a slightly decentered, less human approach to vision, much like what Steina approached in this work, All Vision, for example, entrusting the kind of a decision of where to look to a mechanical system. So, you know, what I want to kind of hope to give you, and what I hope you'll take away into looking at Steina's works and into thinking about sound-image relationships in the world around you, is that these images are complex and multifaceted, and there's a lot of opportunity in thinking about the potential of these relationships, the potential of signals to mediate these relationships beyond the kinds of things that we normally encounter in our daily lives. Thank you.